My name is Maarten de Wit. I am a member on the OMERACT Executive Committee on behalf of the Patient Research Partners Group. And I'm also a volunteer for EULA, the European League Against Rheumatism, and active in setting up an online training course for patient research partners all around the world. This webinar we will do together with Ingrid. And
good morning,
Ingrid,
everyone.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you, Maarten. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ingrid de Groot. I'm chair of the diagnosis working group of myositis for the Dutch Muscle Disorders Patient Association, and I'm also involved in OMERACT. I'm the PRP for the OMERACT the myositis working group. So that's why I'm telling you later this morning. I will tell you about the work we've been doing on the domains.
So what we will deal with, we will introduce the objectives first. Tell a little bit a summary of what a core domain set is, and then Ingrid will introduce you to the case of myositis, and specifically also highlight her personal experience and her role in the myositis working group as a patient representative. And if time allows, we will have some time for questions and answers. So what we would like to do today is to provide you a general introduction in the OMERACT way of developing a core domain set. In a previous webinar, we have introduced the concept of the OMERACT core outcome set. And then we said to do this, it's a two-step process. And today we will specifically look at the first step, which is about developing a core domain set. We will introduce the importance of patient involvement in this process and specifically explain the role and experiences of a patient research partner in this process. I think it's good and fair to say that participation in this webinar does not imply that people can attend the OMERACT meeting 2020. But I think it's also fair to say that most of the work is done in the working groups during the time between meetings. So I think therefore we find it very important that people understand how OMERACT development processes are laid out. So this webinar and the topic of today, the information, if you are interested afterwards to read some more, you can find information in the OMERACT handbook. It's a handbook with a lot of information on different topics, but specifically chapter 4 deals with domain set development. Working groups who are working on developing a domain set will all receive a workbook. And a workbook is a kind of living document where they track and monitor their own work step by step. So if you are a member of a working group, you can always ask for this workbook, and then you can see at what stage they have already arrived. If you want to find the OMERACT handbook and also a template of this working book that we use, go to the OMERACT website, omeracthandbook.org, and you will find with this figure that you see left down under, if you press there, it will bring you to chapter 4, where the development process is described in more detail. So as a summary, let's start with explaining the process of developing a core outcome set. As said, OMERACT distinguishes between two steps. The first step is focused on finding out what is important to measure. And in the early days, this was done only by the physicians and the researchers. But since 2002, OMERACT has acknowledged that you cannot develop a domain set without active input and contributions from patients. So this is a broad stakeholder initiative where all stakeholders are asked to inform the working group what they think is important to measure in every clinical trials. OMERACT only deals with clinical trials and observational studies. A core domain set can be defined as a minimum set of domains and subdomains necessary to adequately cover all core areas. These are core areas of health, and I will explain this a little bit more in a minute. The second step is, if you know what is important, you have to think about the instruments, how to measure these domains. And a core outcome set can be developed as a minimum set of instruments that must be administered throughout each intervention study. And the instruments should adequately cover the corresponding core domain set. Today we will only focus on step 1, the development of a core domain set. Before we continue, it's also important to know how a core domain set looks like. And we have called this the OMERACT onion. The onion has 3 layers. And if you go to the inner circle, so it's the core of the outcome set, you will find all mandatory domains that are necessary to measure in all clinical trials. But recently, in 2018, we have added that in some cases, in some circumstances, a particular domain should also be mandatory to include. And that is for a particular symptom that is only relevant in a small subgroup of patients for which you develop a new intervention. If you develop a new intervention or you test a new drug for the entire group, it might not be relevant or justified to also measure a symptom that only a small group of patients in this group is confronted with. So therefore, but to acknowledge the importance of that domain for the subgroup, we introduce this mandatory domains in certain circumstances. Oh, I go backwards. So that the middle circle of the onion includes all important domains that we find they are of importance to some or to all stakeholders, but they are still optional. They are not mandatory to measure in every clinical trial. So you might include them in your trials, but you don't have to. And then in the outer circle, there you will find all the domains that we don't have enough information about, whether they are important. So we have identified it, but we don't know anything about the severity or the frequency, or it's a domain for which we don't have an instrument yet. And before we can make it mandatory, you first have to develop an instrument. So all these domains we put on the research agenda, and then they belong to the outer circle. So these all together form the core outcome set or domain set from the perspective of OMERACT. I promise you to say a little bit more about the core areas of health that need to be thoughtfully considered in every core outcome set development process. And we distinguish between 4 categories of domains. The first one are pathophysiological manifestations or abnormalities. So here you have to think about all the physical, sometimes we call them also biomarkers, things that you can see on an image. They can often be objectively measured, or they are sometimes measured by a physician, like swollen joint counts or painful joint count, and sometimes also blood values or things that you can find out in the laboratory. This group, in the past, many core sets had mainly this type of domains. But since patients enter the area, it has become obvious that also life impact is important. So in what domains does the disease has an impact and impact the life of people with that condition? And that's becoming more important. And here you have to think about all the domains that are currently also measured by PROs, patient-reported outcomes. Then there is this third category that we call death or lifespan. You have to think about survival rates or life expectancies. For some diseases, we know an important outcome is to prevent people from dying earlier because of their condition. The fourth category is societal or resource use. This is a economical domain, so we also want to look at what's the costs of a new intervention and think also about what is the burden of that new intervention. Although we prefer that every core outcome set has at least one domain from these 4 categories, we say that the fourth one, the resource use, is optional. So if you can't find one, it is allowed to have a core set with a minimum of 3. However, the ideal core set has between 7 and 9 domains. Finally, you have to consider contextual factors and adverse events. Adverse events do not have to be added to a core set because they are already by law and by the regulatory agencies mandatory to measure in every clinical trials. So we know that if a trial starts, adverse events will be monitored anyway. Contextual factors is a very difficult concept, but these are factors that can influence a particular outcome. So we know, for instance, that disease activity can be influenced by age or by gender. So it is not a domain in itself, but it is something that you need for some trials. You have to consider them because you have to know how the population in that trial is and how this might have some bias or impact on particular scores. And this is what we call contextual factors. So finally, a summary of the process of developing a core domain set. And within OMERACT, we distinguish 3 steps. And we start with generating the domains. And in a minute, Ingrid will show you how the myositis group went about. And if you have identified all the relevant domains, you need to agree on a reduction of the number of domains. You have to prioritize and find out what are the most important domains. And then finally, if you have a proposed set of domains, you have to bring them into the voting process, which takes place currently at the meeting, but in the future it might also be done virtually. And explain your core set to the OMERACT community and ask for their opinion and endorsement. And that's what we do in step number 3. If you want to find out a summary of this process, it is in the chapter 4 of the handbook, and we use this illustration to clarify the process. So, coming at the end of this introduction, are there any questions so far? And if not, I take silence. Tom, do you have a question?
No, Martin, no.
Oh, okay. In that case, I would like to hand over to Ingrid and introduce the work that the myositis working group has done.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, oh, well, that's actually a nice slide to start with. I will tell you something about how we went about our search for the core domain set in myositis. And this slide you see, there was an editorial about our last article that was, or manuscript that was published in the Journal of Rheumatology. And actually the editor, the guy you see in the picture there, he's not from the working group, he's Mr. Adam Huber, and he's, in his editorial, he said something about the importance of patient input in developing outcomes and outcome measures. So next, please, Martin. Martin, can I have the next slide? Yeah, thank you. I will tell you a bit about myositis because it's a very rare disease which affects about 5 in a million people. So I guess not many people have heard about it. So myositis, or idiopathic inflammatory myopathy, is an autoimmune systemic disease. It causes muscle weakness mostly, but it also affects other organs like skin, joint, lungs, and even the heart. And it results in disabilities and in significant limitations in activities of daily living and quality of life. Now, there are several types of myositis. Like we've got the dermatomyositis, which affects both skin and muscle. We have polymyositis, which affects mostly the muscle, but which becomes an outdated term actually because of recently found antibodies. So now we're speaking of immune-mediated necrotizing myopathy and anti-synthetase syndrome. There's 2 other forms of myositis called juvenile dermatomyositis and inclusion body myositis, or IBM. But because these are so different in terms of mechanism and treatment, our myositis working group decided to leave them out of our scope of research. So talking about the scope of our working group, outcomes used in myositis for clinical studies were predominantly based on pathophysiological manifestations of the disease, like Martin was saying something about earlier. Like the most used outcomes were muscle weakness or elevated muscle enzymes, that's the CK levels in your blood, or skin manifestations. But there were actually no patient-reported outcomes on the life impact area. And the existing core outcome set used by doctors and researchers was the one from IMEX, which is an acronym for International Myositis Assessment and Clinical Studies Group. And despite the terminology, the P stands for patient-reported outcome. This outcome set was developed without any input from patients whatsoever. So things were measured that patients did not care about, and the things that patients did care about were not measured. So one of those was life impact of the disease, and that was the goal of some doctors and researchers and patients who started the Myositis Special Interest Group in 2011. So in collaboration with IMEX, we wanted to add the patient's perspective to the existing core set. So life impact as well as pathophysiological domains were included in that one. Next, please. So in 2011, during an aCore meeting, and aCore stands for American College of Rheumatology, which is a big conference, some clinicians and researchers met for an organizing OMERACT Myositis Special Interest Group meeting. And 1 year later, they officially met again during OMERACT 11 in 2012 with an expanded discussion on ensuring international representation of the group and further developing a research agenda. There was one patient at the time, and I wanted at least two. And at OMERACT 2016, 2 new members joined. That was me as a Dutch PRP and an Australian doctor, a neurologist. So now we had 5 countries representing 4 continents, and the 5 countries were, or still are actually, the US, Sweden, South Korea, Australia, and the Netherlands. And the nice thing about our group, because it's a multi-system disease, we have rheumatologists, neurologists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, researchers, and 2 patients. So that's, I think, is quite valuable that we have different disciplines. And in 2016, we met in Canada, and that was my first OMERACT. Next slide, please. I was diagnosed with the dermatomyositis I was telling you about in 2007, and at that time I worked full-time for Child Protection Services, and some years later, well, work was no longer an option because of my illness, but I was a member of the Dutch Patient Association for Muscle Disorders at the time, and I got involved with the Dutch Myositis Working Group. And in 2015, the ENMC, which stands for European Neuromuscular Center, organized a workshop on myositis in Holland, and I was asked to participate as a patient representative. And during that workshop, I met Professor Ingrid Lundberg, who is actually a Swedish myositis expert, and she invited me to join the myositis group as a PRP. From that time on, things happened very fast, because a couple of weeks later, I was invited to join the OMERACT meeting in Whistler, Canada in 2016. That was to be held about 4 months later at the time. So what I did was study the OMERACT handbook and try to familiarize myself with terms as domains, an OMERACT filter, and onions and core sets. I don't know about you, but for me, they were all sort of, what are you talking about? So then I read up on all the work the special interest group had been doing so far. And I joined a Skype meeting session with the working group and 1 or 2, I'm not sure, webinars for PRPs like this one before traveling to Canada. And of course, there was a lot of email contact, and the other PRP, Catherine Sava, on our working group, she was quite experienced, so we emailed quite a lot. So I felt like meeting a friend when I actually saw her the first time. But the first time was exciting. I knew nobody there. The only person I knew, Ingrid Lundberg, wasn't present. So, but I never forget how kind and welcoming everyone was. Not only the SIG members, but all OMERACT attendees and all the other PRPs for that matter. And from that day on, I was one of the guys. That's how it feels. We have done a lot of work. The more we Skyped and emailed, the more I got the hang of it. And by it, I mean the OMERACT jargon and the research. And in 2016, I asked a Dutch myositis expert to join us, for I wanted to involve Dutch patients in the great research project we were doing. And so last year we met again in Australia this time. It was great. It was like meeting friends after a very long time. And in the next slide, you see a picture. There we are. That's in Terrigal. People who were there last time might recognize some of the things in the background. But this is, well, not the whole working group, because South Korea and one of the Swedish and the Dutch were not there, but on the front you see the two PRPs, me in the wheelchair and Catherine next to me. Next, please. Okay, so let's take a look at the work we've been doing. Step 1 in the process, domain set creation. This is how we did it. Next slide, please. Yeah, no, yeah. We started by doing some literature research, and we found that none of the existing patient-reported outcomes for myositis had been developed following currently recommended methodology outlined by OMERACT. The only instrument that did ask patients for input, the myositis activity profile, was looked into as well, but we concluded that it required additional content validation to ensure it accurately reflected the patient experience of the disease. So what we did was, between 2012 and 2014, we organized 11 focus groups with over 60 patients in total in the US, in Sweden and South Korea, because at that time these were the 3 countries that were in the group. These were semi-structured interviews led by facilitators, and what we did is ask every patient there 2 open-ended questions. The first one was, in what way has myositis changed your life? And the second one was, what does a typical day look like? We ended up with over 100 potential domains, and after thematic saturation we got 26 potential domains. And by thematic saturation, I mean that we looked at, for instance, overlapping domains, and by discussing certain domains, you hear the same things again, and at a certain point no new data or themes emerge, and so that's when we stopped, and we had 26 domains, potential domains. At OMERACT 2016, we presented that list of 26, and we asked for advice on how to proceed. As you can imagine, 26 domains is not a realistic or a very pragmatic number to use in clinical trials. So the advice then was to use the Delphi method to reduce the number to a max of 5. Next, please. This was a publication on that work at that time. And next, please. So the next step was starting the Delphi procedure. Yeah. Now, for some of you, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with Delphi, but it's a structured communication method, and it's based on the principle that decisions from a structured group of individuals are more accurate than those from an unstructured group. And after each round, what we did is provide an anonymized summary of the results, and during the process of the next 1 or 2 rounds, the range of answers decreased, and the group sort of automatically converged towards a final decision. And the process of Delphi stops after a predefined stop criterion, which in case of OMERACT is the 70% consensus rule. So Delphi round 1, that was straight after OMERACT, we asked the patients, at that time only the patients, on a scale from 0 to 10, and 0 being not important at all to 10 very highly important, how they rated each of the 26 domains. The results were that 19 of the 26 were rated highly important by over 70%, of the 541 patient respondents. All the 26 domains were rated at least a 5, but as you can imagine, 19 PROs is still an impractical number to use, so we needed to narrow that down. So there was a second round of Delphi, which was in September 2017. This time we included healthcare providers and caregivers as well. And what we did was ask people to pick their top 10 of most important domains out of the 26. And in the later stage, to prioritize those 10 domains from 1 being the most important to 10. The results then were that 638 participants from 48 countries rated their domains. Over 70% consensus we got on fatigue, on physical activity, and on muscle symptoms. Now, 600, that's the beauty about Delphi. You can reach out to a lot of people worldwide because 638 might not seem a lot, but actually for a very, very rare disease as myositis, it's an amazing number. But we needed a third round. So we did that just prior to the Terrigal meeting in Australia. That was intended to check if any additional domains reached 70% consensus. We asked all participants, again, patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals for their top 5 this time. And to align with the 3 circles or onion format of OMERACT that Martin was just talking about, respondents were now asked to place each domain in one of the 3 categories, like which you could refer to as the inner circle, the middle, or the outer circle. So the question was, this item should be used every time in clinical practice, clinical trials and research, or this item should be an optional item considered in some circumstances but not mandatory, or for the outer circle, more research needs to be done on this item before this decision can be made. The results, 541 respondents, of whom 410 patients participated, and pain made it into the inner circle as well. Next, please. And the table in the next slide shows the results of the Delphi according to the main 3 stakeholder groups you see on top there. So the patients, healthcare providers, the HCP, and the caregivers. Next, please. When we look at the respective top 5 of both patients and healthcare providers, we can see significant differences. Patients seem to decide mostly on domains that affect daily living, and healthcare providers, on the other hand, chose domains which they always had been measuring in the clinic. So the top 5 for patients is muscle symptoms, fatigue, levels of physical activity, medication, side effects, and pain. And the healthcare providers chose muscle symptoms, level of physical activity, lung symptoms, dysphagia, which is problems swallowing, and skin symptoms. As you can see, there's only the ones in red are the ones that we sort of agree on that they should be in the top 5, but otherwise we have different opinions. So we wrote about this again, about our findings in another manuscript that was also published, and where Catherine and I were co-authors, which is also a great thing about OMERACT, that you can participate as being a co-author. And the third and final step in this process is the voting process. So at OMERACT 2018, over 200 qualitative researchers, clinicians, and PRO methodologists and patients were present at the voting session. And our Myositis working group presented the data that we generated over the prior 5 years period, leading up to a proposed core domain set, which you see here. And in order to move forward with patient-reported outcome measure development, a consensus defined by at least 70% agreement of all the people present must be reached for our proposed core domain set. And the voting results on that beautiful sunny day in Australia were that we got 96% endorsement on the inner circle, 98 on the middle circle, and 76 on the outer circle. Now looking closely, you can see an empty middle circle. Originally, the mandatory in specific circumstances, which is the top box within the green box, Martin was telling you about this earlier, we added during our presentation that we felt that the middle circle didn't do these domains, we're talking about lung, joint and skin, do any justice, because myositis is a multi-system disease, and we thought these domains should be mandatory in the case of, for example, a trial with new drugs for ILD, which is interstitial lung disease. It's a dangerous but a common complication in myositis. It ended up in the middle circle, but we felt it should be in the inner circle, but according to the rules, we could not do that. So according to OMERACT guidelines, at that time, we were not allowed to put these domains in the inner circle. So during the conference, there had been a lot of discussion amongst other working groups than OMERACT people. And due to the complexity of other systemic diseases, there appeared to be a desire and a need to change or update the original onion. So what you see here on the slide is the result of that, the onion 2.0. So we set mandatory in all trials fatigue, level of physical activity, muscle symptoms and pain, and depending on what trial for what drugs or what extra other organ we're looking into, we have the mandatory in specific circumstances, the lung, the joint or the skin. Okay, thank you, Martin. The next, please. That resulted in another manuscript that was published in the Journal of Rheumatology, in which we saw the first slide that was the editorial that was about this study. So now we know what to measure. The core domains, we are focusing on how to measure. So we have change of focus. That is why we are now studying which instruments, like questionnaires, capture the domains best. And that will take quite some time. If we just look at fatigue, there are hundreds and literally hundreds of questionnaires on fatigue, and we have to look into them, judge their feasibility, but also their validity and so on, and then decide which of those instruments capture fatigue experienced by myositis patients best. Is that one that measures only physical fatigue or mental fatigue or both? And for that, again, we need patients. And our ultimate goal is to replace the current core outcome set, the one from IMAX, which I spoke about earlier, by a new one, and one that involves patients in the development, and which also captures life impact. And by collaborating with IMAX, we ensure the perspective of all major stakeholders are included. So, next slide, please. My role and experience as a PRP is, for me personally, I feel like I'm one of the team, so there's an equal basis. My input is, and also that of Catherine, is asked for regularly. We have very frequent Skype and email contact. I'm not sure about other working groups, but we Skype at least 10 times per year. So like once every 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes more if we're like in the middle of a Delphi. And we email a lot more when, for example, we're working on a new manuscript. We collaborate at the meeting. We've done a lot of articles, so I'm involved as a co-author on several of those, and it resulted in me trying to be, I'm not sure it will be published, but I wrote an article as a first author in the Dutch Journal of Rheumatology about our research. And the great thing about being in a working group with such a rare disease is that we meet a lot in between the meetings. There's a lot of work done between the meetings, but I go to other meetings as well. So I went to EULAR, where I met some of my working group, and last March in Berlin we had the GCOM, which stands for Global Conference on Myositis meeting, a 4-day meeting where most of us were present. So on the right you see a photo of us having dinner, which was combining business and pleasure. And on the left, you see me presenting our OMERACT poster, actually. On the right bottom to the right, you see our OMERACT onion that Martin was just showing you on the slide. So that's what I can tell you about our work.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. I think that was an amazing, great story about your involvement in this working group.